Hello world, my name is Dr. Sohom Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist and I live and work in London. I assess and rehabilitate mentally disordered offenders, or what the tabloids might call the criminally insane. I regularly assess defendants in courts, in prisons, and also in locked psychiatric units that are reserved for the most dangerous and violent patients. Although I specialise in criminal psychiatry, I also have expertise in pretty much most areas of mental illness. This video podcast series, A Psych for Sore Minds, explores a range of mental health topics from severe mental illness and also its relation to crime and violence. I'll share with you a bit about life from the perspective of a psychiatrist. And my USP, I think, is discussing my own personal previous cases. So I've got a fascinating case for you this episode, which gives a very clear example of how drug use can force somebody into criminality. So I would like you to make A Psych for Sore Minds your one-stop shop for information about mental illness. Today, I'm going to answer a basic question in forensic psychiatry and in criminology, which is this: what makes a criminal? i.e., why are some people more likely to offend than others? So I thought that would be an interesting topic to dissect. Right, let's start. So let's go for the easy factors, some of which are demographics, which makes it which are more typical for an average criminal. So criminals most often are men. So men account for about 80% of crimes, and they're usually in their mid to late teens or their 20s, and they often come from dysfunctional family backgrounds. So I'm talking about either very strict or even abusive parenting or caregivers, or very lax boundaries, or sometimes like a combination of the two, which is inconsistent parenting. Many future offenders have friends or family who've been convicted of crimes and they probably didn't do that well at school. So demographically, that's all pretty obvious. As I said before, men commit about 80% of all crimes. And if women do commit crimes, then it's more likely to be fraud as opposed to, for example, violence. Of course, the exception is the crimes that are actively dominated by women, such as prostitution. I think it's interesting to note that the criminal justice system, rightly so, tends to be a bit more lenient with women, and they have like a higher threshold to send them to prison. And sometimes that's because of reluctance to separate the mother from the children. And also, studies have shown that courts are far more likely to try and support or help female defendants compared to their male counterparts. For example, they use community orders that involve drug rehabilitation or psychiatric treatment as opposed to prison sentences. Okay, let's scratch the surface and get a bit deeper and veer into the psychology behind it all. So another relevant issue is that people of certain personality traits or circumstances are more likely to actually take up criminal opportunities if they're presented to them. So for example, impulsiveness or thrill seekers, or if a criminal life provides like a higher status in their particular community, that increases the risks. There are other criminogenic personality traits. So for example, criminals tend to have what we call an external locus of control. So it's always somebody else's fault that they were in that position. Like if somebody said, my mate shouldn't have asked me to carry that knife in the first place, so it's actually kind of his fault that that policeman got stabbed. Another trait would be a lack of empathy, so not actually really caring or fully appreciating the impact of one's crimes. Despite the assumption that there are criminal masterminds, criminals generally have a lower IQ than the general population, which, if you think about it, can decrease their chance of finding legal employment and therefore indirectly kind of directing them towards a life of crime. As well as personality traits, there are specific psychological processes that criminals go through to conceptualize or to at least accept their own crime. So these include things like denial. So denial of criminality, basically saying it wasn't me, like Shaggy circa the year 2000. So that's either denying actually committing the action or admitting the action, but denying the criminal intent part of it. Like, for example, it wasn't really a robbery, Your Honour, because that bloke said he was happy to lend me a tenner a month ago, and I was just holding out my shiny new knife to show it off to him. And then there's also justification and rationalisation. So these are actually very similar. Justification is something along the lines of somebody saying that they had to act violently because if they didn't, in that situation, they would have been a victim, they would have been assaulted. And rationalisation is similar, but it's more kind of general, such as like the belief or the ethos that people who get conned are marks and they deserve to. And minimalisation is where you minimalise the impact of your crime, such as the house that you burgled was obviously owned by very rich people, so they won't miss their belongings. A lot of criminal behaviour is also about modelling as well. So for example, if you witness domestic violence when you're a young boy, then it means you're more likely to commit this as a man towards future partners. And obviously it's very well established that victims of childhood sexual abuse often turn out to be perpetrators when they're older. Also, kids that grow up in a criminal environment, they see crime as a legitimate source of making money, and often they're actually given a helping hand into the criminal underworld. So as youngsters, they run errands, for example, or do things for older relatives, like go on drug runs. Criminals tend to be quite versatile, so contrary to popular belief, most criminals don't stick to one type of crime, but actually commit lots of different crimes. So when I assess potentially mentally ill defendants, I usually get sent the police national computer record, so their criminal record. And the vast majority of the time, they have a long and varied criminal past. It's actually very unusual to see somebody with no criminal records. And in my career, when I see this, it's usually because they've offended completely out of the blue, out of context of their normal behaviours due to severe mental illness, as opposed to something like a personality disorder. If you want to know more about personality disorders, I've done a whole episode, I think it was episode 5 of A Psych for Sore Minds, so go check that out. There are exceptions to criminal versatility, so paedophiles, for example, tend to only commit this type of crime. And also another example would be drug addicts who repeatedly commit either burglaries or robberies or possession of drug charges, and they rarely have any other type of offending like behaviour. Then of course there's mental illness, which is my area of expertise, and I've spoken about this in previous episodes. I've mentioned how some specific mental illnesses and symptoms can directly lead to violence and offending. So check out previous episodes of A Psych for Sore Minds. So there's episode 1 about how autism can cause offending. And I also discussed the case of the 18-year-old man, John T. Bravery, who had autism, who randomly picked up and threw a 6-year-old boy over the balcony at the Tate Modern. I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with that story. Then there's episode 3, where I talk about how delusions can lead to offending and violence, and I give a very clear example of that. And then there's episode 6, where I talk about drug-induced psychosis and how that can lead to offending, and I give a real-life case example of one of my ex-patients who stabbed himself with a pair of scissors. So go to those episodes if you want a detailed breakdown, but just very briefly, typical examples of how mental illness causes offending would be like intense paranoia or hearing voices such as command hallucinations that are telling you to hurt people. And then a big kind of overlap is offending and personality disorders. One in particular is antisocial personality disorder. That is hugely common in the offender profile group that I see. It's also generally common in prisons, in courts, and in secure psychiatric units. Antisocial personality disorder is a mental condition in which you consistently show no regards for right and wrong, no regards for the rights and feelings of other people, and just persistently offend. And I go into this in detail in episode 5, so go check that out. Now, a huge issue that I've not yet discussed, and I'm about to give you a case example, is substance abuse. So substance use, drug use, alcohol is intrinsically connected to crime for many reasons. So for example, if somebody's a drug addict, they might need a constant supply of money to feed their habit. Then if somebody's actually using drugs or substances, they can become more impulsive, violent, or disinhibited when they're intoxicated. And then also there's subtler links. So addicts can come into contact with criminals for their supply of substances, which might increase their chances of offending either with or for criminals. And some people who might previously only have dabbled in substances, once they commit crimes, they now have more money, so they're able to get their hands on more drugs, and they might be mixing with criminals who are already addicted, so they can kind of get drawn into that lifestyle. Okay, I'm going to give you a case example of how drugs can actually cause offending. I'm going to tell you about a man who I previously assessed. So this case, like all the cases I talk about, I anonymise and I change some of the demographic information to make the subjects less identifiable out of respect for patient confidentiality. But I just want you guys to know that the essence of what I'm talking about is 100% real. This case really sticks out in my mind. I think because I felt like really sorry for the man, and I felt just a slight emotional connection to him. So his name is Mr. C, and he was a 22-year-old man who was originally born in the Ukraine, though he came over to the UK with his parents when he was about 10. And if what he says is true, then he has quite a tragic backstory, which snowballed into drug addiction, and he was bullied and pressurised into committing drug-related crimes and ultimately into becoming a criminal. So when I saw Mr. C, it was actually not for a criminal court case, which is the bulk of my work. He'd already served his time in prison. It was actually for an immigration panel, as he was being threatened to be deported back to the Ukraine. So as I said, Mr. C moved over to the UK as a child with his parents. His father was a documentary maker who got an opportunity to work in the UK for a major channel. Mr. C told me that life in the UK was difficult for him right from the get-go. He could barely speak English when he came over here, and also there was a big cultural barrier, and another issue for him was that his family were relatively poor compared to his peers. However, he was really good at football and he managed to make some friends through this, and in his later teens he had a few professional football trials, but unfortunately he didn't make the cut. However, Mr. C got a job and a career as a sound engineer and was relatively successful to a degree. He was kind of working himself up the hierarchy and working with more well-known and established artists. Then, unfortunately, Mr. C's friend tragically died suddenly from a very rare form of cancer, and this happened about 3 years before I assessed Mr. C. And Mr. C was very close to this young man. In fact, they'd met at high school because the other young man had come over from Romania around the same time, so they really kind of bonded in that shared experience and shared circumstances. And basically Mr. C just couldn't recover from the grief. Even months later, he found himself crying on a daily basis when he was alone. And to top it all off, his distress was amplified by his father, who used to tell him off for crying and saying, "Real men don't cry." Mr. C lost a significant amount of weight, and he also lost the motivation to work, and he started losing his regular gigs because he became really lethargic. He lacked motivation. Sometimes he would spend entire days just not getting out of bed. He lost his appetite, lost weight, he was struggling to sleep. So all the things that I'm talking about are typical for a prolonged grief reaction, which is developing into clinical depression. And all of these symptoms and behaviours continued even 7 or 8 months after the death of his friend. Mr. C told me that his personality also changed. So he used to be kind of outgoing, lots of friends, but it turned isolated and withdrawn. And he started coping with his grief by using increasing amounts of alcohol and illicit drugs, specifically cocaine and ketamine. So when I assessed him, he told me that he had dabbled in these substances in the past. He would maybe binge on the weekends once or twice a month when he was clubbing with his friends. However, his drug use, the pattern of his drug use had changed over the space of the months following his friend's death. It escalated quickly until it was a daily use. And also he started using on his own, which from my experience is always a big turning point in the journey towards drug addiction. So Mr. C specifically told me that he used drugs to block out the pain of his friend's death. And he was taking, at his peak, he was taking about 2 or 3 grams of coke a day, as well as a gram of ketamine. And what I think is quite interesting, not really a symptom, but an indication of the drug addiction, was that his circle of friends was changed. His old friends were trying to get him to kick the drugs, and he kind of pushed them out of his life, I guess because he didn't want to face the music. And he hung out with new people who were all relatively high functioning drug addicts. This is where the story gets quite dark. So Mr. C became indebted to a particular drug dealer because he'd racked up a drug debt. He even was beaten up on a couple of occasions, and this dealer threatened that he would hurt Mr. C's friends or family if he didn't pay the sum back. So then Mr. C cut a deal with this dealer, and he would run little errands for him, dropping off packages across London. He never looked inside the packages because the dealer said he would kill him if he did, but I think it's safe to assume that they were drugs or money. So Mr. C carried on doing this for a few months, and he managed to get his debt down, though interestingly it seemed that the drug dealer was being quite manipulative because he would give him more drugs, which would increase the debt, and it would kind of continue the cycle and continue Mr. C having to work for him. Mr. C was eventually arrested in mid-2016. What had happened is he'd stashed one of these packages at a friend's house, and the police had gone round to this house on a completely separate matter, smelt cannabis, searched the house, and then found his stash. So Mr. C hadn't looked inside of it at that point, but surprise, surprise, it was drugs. It was about half an ounce of cocaine. And as he was going through the court process, he pleaded guilty to possession with intent to supply, and he was bailed for several months as the court case was going on. Around this time, Mr. C had tried to, or had kicked the drugs, gotten into a rehabilitation service in the community, and apparently hadn't used drugs at all from that point until I saw him years later. He was also offered antidepressants by a psychiatrist, but he refused them because his kind of ethos was that he wanted to completely detoxify, didn't want any antidepressants, wanted to be free of all substances. Mr. C being arrested was a particularly big blow for him because his parents found out and they were very disappointed. And up until that point, they hadn't really known the extent of his drug use. And for me personally, I think it's quite poignant because he'd actually stopped using drugs at that point. But an even more pressing concern for Mr. C was that the drug dealer blamed him for the drugs being seized. And he was very threatening towards Mr. C and very hostile. He said that basically he had to pay him back, not only for the continued for the previous debt, but also because of the stash that was seized. And Mr. C told me of this quite horrific story where he was blindfolded, he was taken to an abandoned field, he was stripped naked, and he was threatened with a machete. Now I should point out there's no objective evidence of this incident. This is just what Mr. C reported to me. But Mr. C said that he pleaded for his life, and in exchange the drug dealer and his cronies then made him go on a very large errand, which basically involved hiring a car and driving a large package of drugs across the country. And obviously Mr. C was reluctant to do this, but he feared for his life. So Mr. C did this, he drove the car, and the car was stopped by the police, I presume because of some sort of intelligence, and the drugs were found. From memory, it was something like between 1 and 2 kilos of cocaine. So Mr. C received a 3-year custodial sentence, and bear in mind he was already on bail at that time for possession of drugs. So Mr. C served half of this in prison, and he was in a category B prison. And to be honest with you, how do I put this? He didn't strike me as a man who was built for prison. He was very softly spoken, he was timid, he was quite a sort of small, mousy guy. But whilst he was in prison, he took a number of different courses. He learned to become a barber. He also did numerous substance rehabilitation groups. And now the day before the end of his sentence, Mr. C was just told out of the blue that he wasn't being released the next day. He was going to be transferred to an immigration removal centre because of possible deportation to the Ukraine. Poor guy. He thought he'd finally gotten over it all, and he finally thought that he was free from drugs and all the problems. Now this happens. And to top it off, to make it even worse, there wasn't space in the immigration centre, so he was kind of held for an extra 2 weeks in prison before he could be transferred. Mr. C was really distressed at the prospect of being deported to the Ukraine because he only had one senile grandfather out there, and also he couldn't even speak his mother tongue anymore because he just lost the knack over time. So when I assessed Mr. C for the Immigration Tribunal panel, I had to give my opinion on his mental state, his diagnosis, the treatment plan for the future, and also the risk to his mental health if he was going to be deported. Now, as I said, I did feel really sorry for this man, but as always, I had to stay really objective and neutral for my evidence. And I also kind of, at the back of my mind, I was at least aware, as I always am, that I only had his version of events for a lot of what he was saying. So when I see these cases, I do get some objective evidence. I get case papers, witness statements, medical records. In this case, I got Mr. C's prison records and his drug and alcohol community service notes. So they told me, or they corroborated some aspects of what Mr. C told me. Like, for example, the circumstances of his arrest and the fact that he definitely did engage with drug and alcohol services. But it's impossible to get objective evidence of everything. And there were some specific aspects of his life and his story which I couldn't corroborate. So, for example, I didn't know for definite whether he committed these drug-related offences because he was under threat of being hurt or that his friends and family were in danger. He had reported it and it was mentioned several times in the documentation, but there is no objective evidence. Doesn't mean it's not true. I'm just saying that I don't know that it definitely is true either. It's not like a police investigation. I don't have either the time or the resources to dig evidence beyond what I'm provided with. So even though I personally did believe him, I had to stay objective. And I suppose I had to at least accept that it's not unfeasible that he was lying to me and that he had just been dealing drugs for money and just been caught. So, using the objective evidence, I concluded that Mr. C had suffered from depression, and that was reflected by a number of relevant symptoms, which I spoke about before. He lacked energy, he lacked motivation, he wasn't getting out of bed for several days in a row, he lost his appetite, he lost weight, and again, a lot of this was confirmed in the medical notes. Also, the fact that he was offered antidepressants by a psychiatrist is obviously a strong indicator that at one point he had depression. In my report, I also said that previously he satisfied the criteria for dependence syndrome for multiple drugs. Dependence syndrome is what colloquially you might call addiction. So he was addicted to cocaine and ketamine. So in ICD-10, which is like the psychiatrist's Bible, it's the classification system that's used most commonly in the UK, as well as DSM-4, more recently DSM-5. But according to ICD-10, there are 5 core features of dependency syndrome or drug addiction, and these are as follows. Number 1, a compulsion to take substances and difficulty controlling this actual compulsion. Number 2, experiencing physiological withdrawal symptoms when you're not taking these substances, so actually physically feeling the shakes and needing to take substances to get rid of them. Number 3, a gradual increase in the amount of drug consumption, which you'll know as tolerance. Number 4, progressive neglects of other aspects of the sufferer's life. And finally, undertaking great efforts to obtain substances, which is kind of similar, I guess, to number 4. The other thing that I gave an opinion on was this. I said that if Mr. C were to be deported, this would probably cause a decrease in Mr. C's mood. Now that is pretty obvious. That would happen for the vast majority of people in his situation. However, I opined that specifically because Mr. C had clinical depression, this would make him even more vulnerable than the average person for a decline in mood. And I also proffered that in the past, given that Mr. C has had poor coping mechanisms, i.e. he's taken a high amount of drugs to get over the previous tragic incident of his death, this meant that on the balance of probabilities in the future, there'd be an increased risk for him specifically to cope poorly and to get back into drug addiction if he were to be deported. I also highlighted in my reports for the immigration panel that Mr. C had several positive prognostic factors as regards to relapse of mental illness and also as regards to future drug use. So these were the following. He had reportedly disassociated himself from his former drug-using peers. Again, I had to take his word for that. He had remained substance-free or abstinent from substances for well over 3 years. And this was actually confirmed by the fact that he had repeated urine drug screen tests in the community before his arrest and also in prison, and all his urine tests were negative of drugs. And that he seemed very well motivated to stay abstinent from drugs. I say that because he voluntarily tied himself into community rehabilitation services in the community and also in prison. And he'd already made sensible plans for future employment. So he didn't just waste his time in prison, he retrained as a barber, he took various education courses. So ultimately, this is as far as my evidence was allowed to go. I personally am not allowed to make the decision about whether or not Mr. C should be deported. That's solely up to the immigration panel. But hopefully, you can see how my evidence could be quite persuasive. So in this case, the immigration panel agreed. They could have reasonably, to be fair, argued that psychiatry services and drug and alcohol services are available in the Ukraine. Therefore, what I said was not a reason for him not to be deported. And I have actually seen this outcome and this conclusion in previous immigration cases. Okay, to finish off, I wanted to talk about the protective factors against criminality. So these are just as important as the other factors that are likely to increase the chances of offending. So these protective factors are either relevant for to stop people offending in the first place, or if to stop them reoffending during or after prison or rehabilitation, including coming out of a locked forensic psychiatric unit for mentally disordered offenders. So here are some of the factors. There's close relationships with one or more family members, and generally, in fact, positive relationships with non-criminals. Because if you associate with people who are generally law-abiding, then it decreases the chances of you developing or accepting criminogenic attitudes. And I guess it takes more of an effort to get over that hump of breaking the law if it's not the ethos of those around you. Good educational environment, so not only to give you some self-worth and occupy your time, but probably more importantly to increase your chances of getting legitimate employment in the future. So in forensic psychiatric units, there's a big focus on education and vocational training, and even in prison, as we saw the case of Mr. C, he retrained to become a barber. And so that increases your chances of gainful employment in the future. And then if you've got a job already, another criminogenic protective factor is job satisfaction. So to put it bluntly, if you like your job, you're less likely to risk it by doing something criminal. And then there's sociability in general. So if you have a sense of like belonging to the community around you, well then obviously you're less likely to first of all associate with nefarious characters, but also to damage the people or the society around you. But probably the most important protective factor, actually surprisingly, is age. I mean, obviously there are exceptions, there are older hardened criminals, but generally speaking, when somebody's older, they're, for example, married with children, they have a lot more to lose and they've got less reason to risk it all, especially if they have alternative ways of getting money. I suppose the exception to that would be if you hate your wife and your kids. So next week's podcast is going to be another interview. I'm going to speak to a great woman and an established podcaster named 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜𝐡. She's an expert in criminology and also has some experience of suffering from mental illness herself. As always, I'm open to suggestions, so if you are watching this right now or if you're listening to it and you've got any particular ideas, anything you want me to dissect from the perspective of a psychiatrist and to inform you from my clinical experience or to inform other people as well, then please hit me up. I'm all ears. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Instagram, like our Facebook page, and submit an episode idea or any questions to our email, which is psychforsoreminds@gmail.com. I've also recently started doing another mini segment called Time for a Quick Shrink, where I'm happy to answer your questions about your or a loved one or a close person's psychiatric issues if you want some informal advice. So please go and tell your favourite people about A Psych for Sore Minds. They deserve it. Spread the love. Until next time, stay euthymic, homies.